Before we start, a small amount of housekeeping and a small warning. This isn't a light-hearted video particularly, although it's ultimately a positive one. It wasn't especially easy for me to produce, but I hope it helps someone out there in whatever small and strange ways it might do. Also, there is a podcast version of this and a YouTube version of it too. Just search for Clod of War on your preferred platform if this one isn't it, and you should find it there. You know, if you're on YouTube, a like and or a subscribe helps immensely, as do positive reviews on podcast platforms that support it. Okay, housekeeping done. Almost exactly a year ago, I made a video about my reasons for and experience of starting sim racing. It focused on how motor racing, a sport that had become something of a comfort blanket for me, was gone due to global lockdown in March of 2020, and how sim racing had more than adequately filled that gap. Since then, sim racing has become an integral part of my life. Just over 12 months later, while I feel I still have a very long way to go, I think I can say I'm no longer a sim racing noob. If you watched that vid, you'll know it was also part homage to my old man who, despite having passed away almost 19 years ago, remains a much missed influence. He wasn't perfect. A diabetic from birth and born in the 1940s, medicine didn't exactly lead him to believe that he had very long to live, and so he lived his life accordingly. He had a very fatalistic view of his future, not exactly a death wish, but definitely a desire to squeeze the most out of his limited time. And this, a lot of the time, could make him difficult, even traumatic to live with as a child. But it was also this, I think, that made him truly quick on the track and a force of nature, someone to be remembered off the track. He seemed to see fear as something that held him back and would always go for the move if he was the only person at risk. As I said in the previous video, he paid the price for that sometimes. When he died at the age of 58 from a heart attack, and having recently just ticked over from 40-something to 50-something, I eyed that double-digit number rather warily. It was often in motorsport that I found him, in some sense, still with me. And to begin with, that was quite painful. For the first time in my life, I found myself avoiding all forms of motorsport in order to avoid throwing myself in the pit of grief where his memories seemed to lie. Eventually, though, when I learned to walk around that pit, I could allow motorsport back into my life. And now it's a major part of my coping mechanism. You see, losing a person you love, no matter how cantankerous and frustrating they could be, well, that pain can last the rest of your life. What doesn't have to remain is the pit. Sim racing over the last year has unexpectedly given me a chance to not just step around the pit rather than throw myself in it. It's also given me a chance to fill in that hole and keep those memories at the same time. When I started this channel properly last year, I felt like I was moving into my old man's territory. Now though, I feel like this specific territory, sim racing, is my space, and the space of an army of like-minded souls too, like you, I assume. When I first raced Knock Hill in R Factor 2, my local track by the way, and also by the way, is coming to iRacing rather amazingly this year. It brought memories of a life of spectating to the fore, from being a baby to being a parent myself. And then I started to realise I could participate, active, not passive. As my confidence grew, alongside my addiction to the learning curve, I branched out a bit. From WRC8, R Factor 2, and then Assetto Corsa Competizione, I took a punt on Kartcraft, a small title in early access that, while not for everyone, well, boy, was it definitely for me. It was an amazing place to build up some basics, learn to minimise my steering inputs and be gentle on the brake. I could hear my old man's voice in my head, collated from years of him talking about the ins and outs of karting as we drove home from race weekends. I remember he had opinions about treating the throttle in a kart more like a digital input and using the steering to modify whatever that caused. It definitely worked for him, His trophy cabinet proved it, and it felt like great fun to me, although I feel like modern karts might need a more gentle right foot than those early ones did. Sorry, Dad. Almost as important, I realised that a fat lad like me could be just as fast in a kart as the beanpole teens who normally dominate in real life. If nothing else, kartcraft is a major win for all us pie eaters. It felt like a compressed career path. Sim karting gave me confidence that my inputs could be subtle, not sledgehammer-like, and from there I could really start to get involved in sim racing. As real-life motorsport came back on stream, I became less interested in watching the big sim races, I admit. Not because they weren't interesting, but because why would I do that when I could participate myself? It still took me a while to build up the courage, but as of late last year I took on an iRacing sub, something that I set out as a target at the beginning of this whole sim racing journey. I won't get into the major cons of this here, except to say it's understandable that people balk at the subscription model. I chose it as it felt like a safer online model more than anything else, one that encouraged good driving for the most part, although some may say that's laughable, and close racing over the melee that is reputedly the experience in pub races in the likes of ACC, although people do have good reason to dispute that. Also, one with half-decent moderation which can see abusive players get penalised or banned. Over my years of gaming, I've become much less inclined to deal with overly aggressive asshats online. Life's too short, and I can do without that in my own home. So any move forward from me in that regard is a big step. I'm willing to pay for a better moderated experience with people who are as committed as I am to racing clean and mostly being decent human beings. I don't think iRacing has the very best of any one thing in sim racing, moderation aside perhaps, but it has a very good mix of it all. R Factor 2 seems to have the best force feedback, for example, while Assetto Corsa Competizione arguably has the best tire physics right now. What iRacing does have is very good versions of these things in one package, alongside the worst interface in all of sim racing. Expect a video soon which might help with the basics of that, things that I wish I knew when I started. My initial experience was mixed. The Rookie MX-5 series has great cars which are easy to drive and fun, but it's the series where you have the biggest difference in skill levels and, if I'm honest, the biggest difference in approach. MX-5s are where everyone gets their first taste of iRacing, at least in the road section, and semi-serious sim racers often clash with people who've taken a punt on a cheap 1-month sub for a laugh. It can be off-putting, to say the least. As someone who gets every bit as adrenaline-soaked pre-race on iRacing as I did as a high-level hockey player in my teens and 20s, it can be frustrating, to say the least, to get punted by someone who just doesn't care. But that's almost always modified by the next race, or the next one, whichever one happens to be the one that you have an amazing close race with people who respect your time and theirs, understand the time you've put into learning the tracks in the car, and understand that while accidents happen, there's a lot you can do to mitigate that. This kept me going through Rookie MX-5s, but has really shown itself to be true in Skip Barber's, where I am now. This class is a logical step up, has close racing and a satisfying learning curve. There's no doubt we all still make mistakes in the Skippy all the time, but for the most part, it's easy to see that these are genuine accidents. The step up has seen me race against people who at least don't want to actively punt me off the track. Again, most of the time. Yes, that's always still a possibility, but I found it a much more thrilling, as opposed to stressful, experience. This newfound commitment, in turn, has led me towards a bad case of gas. Gear acquisition syndrome. In the last 6 months, I upgraded from my trusty old G29 to a TSXW. I've changed my seat again, and because my wife is awesome, I got a handbrake stroke sequential shifter for my 50th birthday. Despite this, I still see sim racing as the great motorsport leveler. None of the kit I listed is necessary to be fast. Good old Stoffel van Dorn was plenty fast in a G29 last year, until somebody convinced him to go with a Fanatec. If you have a console and a G29 or G920 or similar, you can race. If you have a half-decent PC, then you can go much further down the rabbit hole too. More than any other game genre out there, sim racing mimics the environment and controls nearly perfectly, G-forces in the cockpit aside. I often hesitate to talk about esports as an actual sport, But with sim racing, the pre-race nerves, something I need to learn to cope with as they're awful.
Oh, my nerves.
The control system, the field of human opponents, it all feels like a real sport to me. So in my eyes, it is one. I treat my races on iRacing like a real race weekend, with a proportionate amount of effort and time commitment. I practice, I learn the track, because at this stage I don't know the tracks, and then I race twice, because I find it genuinely tiring to do more, not least because the force feedback on the new wheel is strong, but also I find it sapping in terms of stress levels. Then I move on to next week's practice and so on. Now my dad would recognise this routine, because he's the one I learned it from. If there's one thing I know now, it's that were he still around at the age of 78, he'd be diving into this right now, and he would absolutely love it. I could never persuade him to grab a PlayStation pad and give Gran Turismo a go. The control system always seemed totally alien to him. But now, in the time we live in, with the tech we have to hand, he'd be double D clutching like the pro he was, because you can with this tech. As for me, sim racing has kept me sane during one of the scariest and saddest and most stressful periods in global history. You simmers have been more than a welcome distraction. Here's to many more years of real racing in a virtual space. Stay safe, stay well, and stay happy. Bye!
Yes. Ow, my fingers.